He wasn't human. He couldn't speak, salute, or follow orders, not in the way soldiers usually did. Yet, he carried ammunition under fire,
Hurry up with those shells!
Wrestled with his comrades for fun, drank beer from bottles, and once stood on his hind legs to salute an officer. His name was Wojtek, a 500-pound Syrian brown bear, and in 1942 he joined the Polish army. This is not a legend. It's a true story of war, brotherhood, and the strangest soldier who ever lived.
This is very good bread.
It is delicious.
A bear who went from an orphaned cub in the mountains of Iran to a decorated member of a fighting unit on the front lines of World War II.
A very good friend.
And somehow, this bear reminded men who had lost everything: their homes, their families, their country, what it meant to feel human again. In the spring of 1942, the world was burning. The Nazis had invaded the Soviet Union. The Allies were fighting across Africa, and somewhere between those fronts, a convoy of exhausted Polish soldiers trudged through the deserts of Persia. These men had escaped Soviet labor camps, starved and broken, now marching to join the British under General Anders. They were heading west, toward hope, toward freedom. Most carried only rifles, rags, and memories of what they'd lost. Among them was Corporal Piotr Prentice, a quiet man with kind eyes, who would soon meet the creature that changed his life. Near the mountain village of Hamadan, the soldiers stopped to rest. Local tribesmen had gathered nearby to trade. Among their goods, a tiny bundle wrapped in a cloth, squirming softly. When the soldiers looked closer, they saw fur, golden brown, soft as sand, a bear cub. Its mother, the tribesmen said, had been shot by hunters. The cub had been rescued, but it wouldn't survive much longer without milk. The soldiers hesitated. They had seen enough death, enough helplessness. But one of them, a young Polish woman named Irina Bokiewicz, traveling with the army, stepped forward and offered a few coins and some tins of condensed milk. The cub became theirs. He was small enough to fit into Irina's arms. They fed him milk from an empty vodka bottle, wrapped him in blankets, and named him Wojtek, a Polish diminutive meaning happy warrior. At first, the bear was just a curiosity, a distraction from the grim monotony of war. But as the days passed, something remarkable happened. Wojtek began to bond with the soldiers. He followed them everywhere. When they marched, he waddled behind, mimicking their steps. When they stopped to rest, he curled up beside them, snoring like an overgrown puppy. They taught him tricks, how to shake hands, how to salute, even how to carry heavy boxes between trucks. He was clumsy, always hungry, always playful. He'd sneak into tents to steal fruit or bread, then run off with his loot while the men chased him, laughing for the first time in years. But beneath the laughter, something deeper stirred. These men had lost their homes, their families, even their country. But in this small creature they found something pure, a reminder of innocence, of companionship, of life untouched by politics or hatred. Wojtek was more than a mascot. He was medicine. By the time the convoy reached Baghdad, the bear had grown too large to ride in anyone's lap. The men built him a wooden crate for the back of a truck, but he rarely stayed in it. He preferred sitting upright, paws over the edge, like a curious passenger watching the world roll by. Civilians stared in disbelief as a column of weary soldiers passed through the desert, and at the back of one truck, a bear rode calmly beside them, head high as if he, too, belonged there, and somehow he did. By the time the convoy reached the outskirts of Baghdad, Wojtek was no longer a cub. He was a growing bear, already stronger than any man in the unit. But what made him remarkable wasn't his strength. It was how human he seemed to become. He imitated the soldiers. When they sat by the campfire, he'd lumber over, drop down beside them, and hold his paws out as if to warm them too. When they drank from their canteens, he reached for one of his own, a tin cup that one of the men had fashioned just for him. They started giving him sips of beer, laughing at the way he smacked his lips and blinked slowly, clearly savoring it. Soon he developed a taste for it, and when the men clinked their bottles together in toasts, Wojtek raised his paw as if demanding one too. He slept in tents, wrestled with privates, and learned to walk upright like a man. And every morning, when the bugle sounded, he'd stand tall and lumber toward formation, mimicking the soldiers lining up for roll call. At first, the officers thought it was a joke. A bear at attention, mouth slightly open, tongue lolling out. But the men took it seriously. They taught him commands. They even created a space for him in the ranks. When trucks rolled out for supply runs, Wojtek climbed aboard without needing an order. When the soldiers hauled crates of ammunition or food, he followed, grabbing boxes in his massive paws and carrying them effortlessly from one truck to another. Wojtek worked like two men, one corporal laughed. He eat like five, another added. They weren't exaggerating. The bear could lift heavy artillery shells as if they were toys. But despite his size, he was gentle, especially with the younger soldiers. He'd nudge them softly with his nose when they looked tired, or sit beside them during breaks, head tilted as if listening to their troubles. To these men, survivors of Soviet gulags, refugees who had watched their families vanish in war, Wojtek wasn't just a pet. He was hope made flesh. He gave them something to care for again. The officers eventually accepted it. One British commander, after inspecting the camp, reportedly asked, "Who's responsible for this?" "Creature." A Polish sergeant saluted. "Private Wojtek, sir." The officer blinked. "Private?" "Yes, sir. Enlisted in the 22nd Transport Company." And that's how it began. The paperwork, half in jest but officially signed, that made Wojtek a registered soldier of the Polish army. He was given a service number, a paybook, used mostly to track his rations, and a place on the roster. Rank, private. Specialty, ammunition carrier. From that day, he was no longer the bear they rescued. He was their comrade, and Wojtek took it seriously. When strangers approached the camp, he'd growl softly until he recognized a familiar uniform. When officers barked commands, he'd stand still, chest puffed out as if proud to belong. He wasn't trained for war, but he gave the men something few things could: a reason to laugh, to protect, to feel alive in the middle of a world gone mad. When they moved north to Palestine, then across the Mediterranean to Egypt, Wojtek went with them. He swam in the Nile. He stole melons from markets. He became a celebrity wherever they went, and as the Polish army prepared for the next great campaign, the invasion of Italy, Wojtek was there, still growing, still loyal, still following his brothers in arms wherever they marched. He didn't know what awaited them in Italy. No one did. But soon, Wojtek would face the true test of a soldier. Not in training, not in campfire games, but on the battlefield itself. By early 1944, Wojtek had become a legend within the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. His size was enormous now, nearly 7 feet tall when standing, his fur thick and bronze, his paws powerful enough to crush helmets like paper. But to the soldiers, he was still the same playful companion who stole their bread and sat too close by the fire. When the order came for the Polish II Corps to move to Italy, the men were ecstatic, not because they wanted to fight, but because they would finally play their part in liberating Europe. Yet there was a problem. Animals weren't allowed on troop ships. When the transport lists were compiled for the voyage from Alexandria to Taranto, the officers realized Wojtek couldn't simply be smuggled on board as equipment. Regulations were clear. No unauthorized livestock, mascots, or personal animals could be brought into a combat zone. But the Polish soldiers refused to leave him behind. They had shared everything with him. Hunger, laughter, fear. Wojtek wasn't a mascot to them. He was a brother. So they came up with a solution that would go down in history. They made it official. Wojtek was formally enlisted as a soldier in the Polish army, complete with a rank, a service number, and a paybook. His occupation was listed as transport worker. He received rations equal to a human soldier. Double, actually because of his size. When British officials inspected the boarding lists, they raised an eyebrow at one name. Private Wojtek? The officer asked. I don't recall that surname. The Polish sergeant simply saluted. He's a strong recruit, sir. You'll recognize him easily. And so, the bear became a soldier at sea. When the ship finally sailed, Wojtek stood on deck with the others, fur ruffling in the salty wind, watching the waves. Sailors fed him fruits, tossed him fish, and laughed as he waved his paw in gratitude. He seemed calm, but beneath the surface, something stirred. The energy of men who were heading toward war. In April 1944, the ship reached the Italian coast. The Polish II Corps was assigned to one of the hardest and most infamous battles of the war, Monte Cassino, the mountain fortress held by German troops that had resisted months of Allied assaults. It was hell on earth. Steep cliffs, minefields, constant artillery fire. The monastery at the top of the hill had become a symbol of defiance and destruction. And into this chaos came the 22nd Artillery Company, with their bear. At first, the British and American troops laughed when they saw him. What's next? A lion in the Royal Navy? Someone joked, but soon laughter turned to awe, because Wojtek didn't flinch under bombardment. He didn't panic at explosions or gunfire. When shells whistled overhead, he stood tall, curious but unafraid. The men had trained him to carry crates of ammunition. Now, under the scorching Italian sun, with German shells raining down, Wojtek got to work. He lumbered between trucks and artillery positions, gripping wooden crates in his massive paws, carrying them to the front line. Each crate held live artillery shells, heavy enough to take 2 men to move. Soldiers paused, staring in disbelief. There he was. A bear, walking upright through a war zone, bombs bursting in the distance, calmly delivering ammunition like a veteran soldier. And the strangest part, the men said he seemed proud, as if he understood that this was serious, that this was his duty. When the firing stopped each evening, Wojtek returned to camp. The soldiers would feed him fruit, honey, and beer, praising him like one of their own. They even drew a new insignia for their company, a bear carrying an artillery shell. It became their official emblem. To the British, it was absurd. To the Germans, it was terrifying. To the Poles, it was poetry. A bear, once orphaned and helpless, now stood for courage, loyalty, and survival. And in a war that had taken everything from them, that bear reminded them of something priceless, that even in madness, friendship and bravery could still exist. But Monte Cassino was only the beginning. The battle would rage for weeks, and soon Wojtek's legend would grow beyond the lines, whispered across camps and countries, until even those who never met him would know of the bear who fought like a man. The air around Monte Cassino was thick with death. Artillery thundered day and night. The hills shook. Smoke rolled down the slopes like storm clouds, swallowing entire battalions in gray mist and blood. It was May 1944, and the Allies' 4th attempt to capture the mountain fortress had begun. The Polish II Corps had been given the impossible task: take the monastery at the top. Every inch of ground was soaked in mud, shrapnel, and history. The Germans had the high ground, machine guns dug into the rocks, artillery hidden among the ruins of ancient stone walls. The men of the 22nd Transport Company were the lifeline. They had to keep the guns fed. Without ammunition, the assault would fail. Without supply, the front would collapse. That's where Wojtek came in. From dawn till dusk, the bear worked beside the soldiers. His thick fur, matted with dust and sweat, glistened in the sun. He carried shells from the trucks to the guns, padding calmly through chaos that turned most men's nerves to ice. Bombs fell close, so close that the earth trembled under his paws, but Wojtek never ran. When a crate split open, scattering shells in the mud, he stooped, gathered them in his arms, and carried them on. Oblivious to the gunfire cracking overhead, to the men watching, it was more than strength. It was faith, silent, wordless faith that the job mattered. A British captain, watching through binoculars, was stunned. "There's a bloody bear hauling ammo up the hill," he exclaimed. His sergeant, without missing a beat, muttered, "Aye, and he's doing it faster than our men." Soon, every unit in the area had heard about the Polish bear at the front. When shells arrived at gun positions, crews would shout, "It's Wojtek's load. Handle with care." The men said he brought them luck. Some swore the guns fired straighter when he delivered the shells himself. Others said the sight of him walking calmly through shell fire made them believe they could survive anything. But luck wasn't on everyone's side. The fighting at Cassino was brutal. Polish soldiers died by the hundreds climbing the rocky slopes under machine gun fire. They fought with bayonets, grenades, even bare hands in the ruins of the monastery. The bear couldn't fight beside them, but his presence anchored their courage. When wounded men were carried back, they often reached out to touch his fur as they passed, like touching something pure in the midst of horror. And when the monastery finally fell, when the Polish flag was raised on its shattered walls after weeks of blood and loss, the men said it felt as though Wojtek had won it with them. He had carried more than ammunition. He had carried their morale, their laughter, their humanity through the fire. After the battle, as silence finally settled over the mountains, Wojtek sat beside the soldiers at dusk. They shared their rations with him, bread, apples, beer. He licked their hands and rested his massive head in one soldier's lap. That night, one of the men carved a small wooden medallion with a bear carrying a shell, the new emblem of the 22nd Company. He nailed it to a post near camp. Underneath, he scrawled 2 words in Polish, "Nasz Wojtek," our Wojtek. For those men, the bear wasn't an animal anymore. He was a symbol of everything they'd fought to protect: loyalty, courage, and the fragile spark of decency that war could never quite extinguish. The Allied command officially recognized Wojtek's contribution. His name appeared on supply records. His image became the unit insignia. And among the soldiers of the Polish II Corps, the bear who had once been a cub in the desert became immortal. But wars never end cleanly. And for Wojtek and his brothers, the greatest challenge wasn't surviving the battlefield, it was surviving what came after. After Monte Cassino, the war moved north, through battered towns, broken vineyards, and valleys that smelled of gunpowder and spring rain. But wherever the Polish II Corps went, Wojtek went too. His legend had spread far beyond the front lines. British soldiers saluted when they saw him. American engineers begged for photographs. Even generals stopped by the Polish camps just to witness the bear who carried artillery shells. But for the men who had marched with him since Persia, nothing about Wojtek seemed strange anymore. He was simply one of them. When they broke camp, he helped dismantle tents, dragging ropes in his teeth. When convoys rolled out, he climbed onto the trucks like a veteran, sitting upright in the back, paws resting on the railing, eyes scanning the horizon. And when evenings came, and the men built fires among the olive trees, Wojtek sat close by, leaning against whoever was nearest, his massive warmth comforting in the chill Italian night. He loved beer, of course. That was nothing new. But now, his favorite trick was to sneak into the supply tent, open bottles with his claws, and drink them like a man. If caught, he'd freeze, eyes wide, the bottle still between his paws, as if saying, "I was just guarding it." The officers pretended to scold him, but no one ever stayed angry for long. You couldn't. Not with Wojtek. To the men, he represented something they could never quite explain. A reminder that even amid horror, innocence could survive. That they, too, could still feel joy, even after everything they'd seen. But beneath the laughter, a shadow lingered. The war was nearing its end. The Allies were pushing into northern Italy, and the Germans were in retreat. Yet for the Polish soldiers, victory brought no peace. Their homeland, Poland, had been liberated, but by the Soviets, not by them. The very nation they fought for was being consumed by another empire. News trickled in slowly. Families gone, villages erased, Home, for many, no longer existed. It was Wojtek who kept them sane. When the men received letters that broke their hearts, the bear would nudge them softly with his nose, sit beside them, and rest his heavy head on their shoulders. Somehow, without words, he seemed to understand. He didn't care who won or lost. He didn't care about borders or flags. All he cared about was his pack, his brothers. At one camp in Bologna, a war correspondent snapped a photo that would become famous. Wojtek sitting in a jeep, tongue lolling out with a Polish officer at the wheel. The caption read, "The Polish Bear Goes to War." That picture made its way into newspapers across Europe. Children clipped it out and pinned it to their walls. For a brief moment, amid headlines of death and destruction, Wojtek became a symbol of something pure, the absurd, heartwarming resilience of life in wartime. When victory finally came in 1945, the men cheered. They hugged, they drank, they cried. And Wojtek, sensing their excitement, stood on his hind legs and roared so loudly the camp echoed with laughter. The war was over, but for Wojtek and his brothers, peace would prove more complicated than any battle. Because when the shooting stopped, the world they had fought for no longer existed. And soon, they would learn that the hardest part of every war isn't surviving the fight. It's figuring out what to do after. In May 1945, the guns of Europe finally fell silent. For the first time in 6 years, the skies over Italy were clear of bombers, and the soldiers of the Polish II Corps gathered to hear the words they dreamed of for years. The war was over. Some wept openly. Others just stared at the ground, hollow-eyed, too exhausted to feel anything at all. They had fought across deserts and mountains, from the sands of the Middle East to the ruined monasteries of Italy. They had bled beside the British and Americans, buried friends under foreign soil, and dreamed of one thing only, to return home. But home was gone. News came slowly, carried by rumor and radio. Poland was liberated, but not by its own sons. The Soviets now ruled there, and the men who had fought under British command were branded traitors and exiles. To return meant imprisonment, or worse. In the camps, joy turned to silence. They were soldiers without a country, heroes without a home, and in the middle of that despair, there was Wojtek, still padding around the camp like nothing had changed. He had no concept of politics, no borders, no sides. He knew only his men. And for those men, that was enough. After the disbandment of the Polish II Corps, the soldiers were offered the chance to emigrate to Britain. They would be processed through a base in Scotland where they could decide their futures, to stay, to work, to rebuild their lives from nothing. There was only one problem. What would happen to the bear? Technically, Wojtek was still enlisted. His paybook listed him as Private Wojtek, Polish Army. His rank had been official, his rations calculated like any soldier's. But the British government didn't have a regulation for demobilizing a bear. The officers debated for weeks. They couldn't just abandon him, but they couldn't exactly hand him a passport either. Finally, the decision came. Wojtek would travel to Scotland with the rest of the men. He would be stationed with them at Winfield Camp near the quiet town of Berwickshire. When the ship left Italy, the soldiers cheered as Wojtek lumbered aboard, sitting proudly among them. To the dock workers and sailors, it was a surreal sight. A massive bear wearing a military insignia, riding to freedom with a smile on his face. The voyage north was long and cold. Wojtek slept on deck, wrapped in a tarp, his breath misting in the air. The men took turns feeding him fruit, bread, and the occasional bottle of beer. By now, he had learned to unscrew the caps himself. When the ship docked in Scotland, reporters were waiting. Cameras flashed, headlines followed. The soldier bear comes to Britain. At Winfield Camp, life settled into a strange peace. The war was over, but for Wojtek, the military routine continued. Each morning, he walked the camp's perimeter with the guards. Each afternoon, he played wrestling matches with the men, pinning them easily to the ground and then rolling away, careful not to hurt them. Children from nearby villages sneaked to the fence just to watch him. The soldiers would wave them closer, handing out biscuits through the wire for them to feed the bear. He was gentle, almost human, When the men sang Polish songs, he swayed. When they laughed, he grunted softly, as if joining in. But something was changing. The soldiers began to leave. One by one, then in groups. Some found work in nearby towns, others went to London or Manchester, trying to start new lives. The camp grew quieter with each passing month, and for Wojtek, that silence hurt more than any gunfire ever had. He would sit by the gate for hours, waiting for faces that never returned. He didn't understand that the war had ended, that his brothers were gone, scattered across a foreign land. He had been a soldier all his life, but now, with no army and no home, Wojtek had become something no one could quite define. A hero without a war, a bear without a purpose, and soon even the Polish army would have to make its final decision about him. A choice that would break hearts across the camp. By 1946, Winfield Camp felt like a ghost of what it once was. The parade ground, once alive with laughter, now echoed with the wind. Tents sagged, equipment rusted, and the smell of campfires was replaced by damp earth and rain. The Polish soldiers who had once filled it with songs and stories were slowly vanishing, finding work, joining families, or leaving for faraway lands that promised new beginnings. But Wojtek stayed. Every morning, he still walked the perimeter as if inspecting the troops. Every evening, he waited at the gate, watching trucks roll out and never return. He could smell their absence, the missing scent of tobacco, soap, and gun oil, and it made him restless. The men who remained did their best to keep his spirits up. They played with him, fed him chocolate, wrestled with him on the grass. But even they knew what was coming. Word had arrived from London. The Polish Resettlement Corps, the temporary army group managing displaced Polish soldiers, was being dissolved. Those who stayed behind would become civilians. And as civilians, they could not legally keep a bear. It didn't feel real at first. How could anyone explain that to Wojtek, the soldier who had carried shells through Monte Cassino? How could you tell a bear that his service had ended? Captain Antoni Chominski, one of Wojtek's oldest friends, argued for weeks. He wrote letters, pleaded with British authorities, insisted that Wojtek was no ordinary animal. "He is one of us," he wrote. "He shared our food, our danger, our laughter. He has earned his place among soldiers." But regulations were regulations. Eventually, a single order came through. Private Wojtek, Polish Army, to be transferred to Edinburgh Zoo for permanent care. The men gathered in silence as the truck arrived. Wojtek, trusting as ever, climbed aboard, nudged by gentle hands and whispered words in Polish. He didn't understand why they looked so sad. As the truck rumbled away, dozens of men stood at attention. Some saluted. Some turned away so no one would see them cry. The bear, sitting tall in the back, turned his head to look at them one last time. His brown eyes met theirs, curious, confused, but calm. In that moment, it wasn't just an animal leaving. It was the soul of the regiment. At Edinburgh Zoo, keepers were stunned by his size and gentle nature. They had been warned he was tame but trained as a soldier, a description that made no sense until they met him. Wojtek walked with a slow, deliberate gait, dignified, almost regal. When visitors gathered, he would stand on his hind legs and wave, as if acknowledging a crowd of comrades. It didn't take long for word to spread. The newspapers came again. Wojtek, the soldier bear, takes up residence in Scotland. Children visited from across Britain to see the bear who had served in the war. They would press against the bars, calling his name, "Wojtek! Wojtek!" and he would rumble softly, lowering his massive head to watch them. But for the Polish veterans who visited, it wasn't just nostalgia. It was heartbreak. Many came on Sundays, wearing their old uniforms, medals pinned to their coats. They would stand quietly by the fence, speaking softly in Polish. Wojtek would pace the enclosure, sniff the air, and then, recognition. He would stop, lift his head, and press his paws to the bars as if trying to reach them. "Wojtek," they would whisper. "Old friend." Some swore they saw tears in his eyes. He had fought beside them, eaten with them, and shared their exile. Now he stood behind iron bars in a foreign land, still loyal, still waiting for orders that would never come. Yet, even behind those bars, Wojtek became something greater than any medal or monument. He became a living reminder that courage isn't limited to humans, that loyalty, friendship, and sacrifice can come from the unlikeliest places. And though the world around him moved on, the Cold War began, nations rebuilt, the soldiers of Monte Cassino grew old, Wojtek remained, carrying their memory quietly, just as he had once carried their shells through fire. At first, the keepers at Edinburgh Zoo didn't quite believe the stories. A bear that had been enlisted as a soldier, a bear that carried ammunition, drank beer, and saluted officers. It sounded like folklore, a wartime exaggeration, something invented to comfort veterans longing for a symbol of their courage. Then they met Wojtek. He didn't behave like any other bear. While the other animals paced restlessly or growled at crowds, Wojtek was calm, patient, and startlingly human. He liked people, especially men in uniform. When soldiers visited the zoo, he would perk up instantly, sniff the air, and lumber to the edge of his pen as if greeting old comrades. He seemed to know them. The veterans of the Polish II Corps came often. Some brought beer, some brought chocolate. And when they spoke in Polish, the language of his youth, his army, his brothers, his ears twitched, and he'd rise up on his hind legs towering above the fence. Waving a paw in greeting, children squealed with delight. Reporters called him the soldier bear, but to the men who had served with him, it was something deeper. Wojtek wasn't a zoo animal. He was a survivor, a symbol of everything they had lost, and everything they had managed to keep. One veteran, Sergeant Jan Wierzbicki, later recalled, "When I saw him behind those bars, it broke something in me. We had been prisoners of war together, he and I. Once under fire, now under peace. And I wondered which one of us had truly been freed." Wojtek's fame spread across Britain. He was featured in newspapers and even radio broadcasts. The BBC called him the bear who went to war. Letters arrived from around the world asking about his story. Visitors poured in, each hoping to glimpse the legendary bear who had fought alongside humans. He had his routines. Each morning, he sat near the front of his enclosure, watching the crowds gather. When a familiar face appeared, a soldier in a Polish beret, a voice with a certain rhythm, he would rumble low in his chest, almost like a purr. He would reach out gently, as if trying to touch the memory that stood before him. Sometimes the veteran sang to him, old army songs from Monte Cassino, words he couldn't possibly understand, yet somehow seemed to. He would sway, his great head moving softly, eyes half closed as if listening. For those who watched, it was haunting. Here was a creature who had lived through artillery, bombings, and battlefields, now confined to a small patch of grass and concrete. Yet he bore no resentment, only patience. He would lift his head to the wind, close his eyes, and breathe deeply, perhaps remembering the wide skies of the Middle East, or the olive-scented air of Italy. But there were moments that broke even the strongest hearts. One day, a group of schoolchildren visited with a Polish veteran as their guide. When they reached Wojtek's pen, the man called out softly, "Czołem, Wojtek! Salute, Wojtek!" The bear, as if hearing a command he hadn't received in years, stood tall, raised one paw, and gave a perfect salute. The children gasped. The old soldier wept. Wojtek didn't know why they cried, only that his gesture made them happy. So he kept doing it. That became his trademark. Whenever he saw a Polish visitor, or anyone who greeted him kindly, he would lift a paw in that same solemn way, the way he used to when saluting officers back in Monte Cassino. It was no trick. It was memory. Years passed. The crowds changed. The veterans grew fewer. But every so often, someone in a faded uniform would still appear at the fence, their face lined, their voice trembling, whispering, "Do you remember, old friend?" And though Wojtek couldn't speak, the look in his eyes said it all. Yes, he remembered. By the 1950s, time had begun to weigh on Wojtek. His once glossy fur dulled to a softer brown. The playful energy that had once sent him tumbling across campgrounds was now slower, quieter. But even as age crept in, his spirit never truly faded. Every morning, he would still rise early, lumber to the edge of his enclosure and sit upright, as if waiting for roll call. The keepers joked that he was still a soldier at heart, reporting for duty long after the war had ended. And, in a sense, he was, for the Polish veterans scattered across Britain. Wojtek had become a living relic, the last piece of the Polish II Corps still standing. Many of them had married, worked, grown old, and buried their dreams of returning home. Poland had been swallowed by Soviet control, and their battle flags, their medals, their language, even their memories, seemed to belong to another world. But Wojtek, he was a link that time couldn't erase. Every year, on the anniversary of Monte Cassino, veterans would gather by the fence at Edinburgh Zoo. Some carried flowers, others brought a bottle of beer, pouring a little into a tin cup and holding it out through the bars. Wojtek would sniff it, his tongue flicking curiously before licking the cup clean. They'd laugh softly, though their eyes would glisten. "Still the same old soldier," one would whisper. "Still drinks like a Pole," another would joke. For a few hours, it felt like the war had never ended, that they were back in Italy, young again, with their friend beside them. The keepers, many of whom had grown fond of Wojtek, began to understand. He wasn't just a bear to these men. He was a reminder of their youth, their bravery, and the brotherhood that had carried them through hell. But as the 1960s approached, fewer and fewer of those men came. The veterans were aging, scattered, dying. Wojtek, too, grew slower. Arthritis stiffened his movements. He slept more. The crowds still came to see him, but they were different now. Families, tourists, curious children who had never heard of Monte Cassino or the Polish army. To them, he was just a storybook creature, a friendly bear with a soldier's name. Yet, even in old age, something remarkable happened. Wojtek became a quiet legend across Scotland. Local newspapers revisited his tale. School teachers told his story to students. Artists painted him, poets wrote about him. To many Scots, he wasn't just a Polish soldier's pet. He was a symbol of courage and loyalty, the kind of story that felt too human to forget. He'd lean against the fence sometimes, eyes half closed as if lost in thought. Perhaps he remembered the crack of gunfire over Monte Cassino, or the laughter of men around a campfire in the desert, or the soft hum of Polish songs beneath the stars. When one of his old comrades visited for the last time, the man was nearly blind and walked with a cane. He called softly in Polish, "Wojtek, do you remember me?" The bear's ears twitched. Slowly, painfully, he rose to his feet, walked to the bars, and pressed his nose against the man's outstretched hand. The veteran stroked his fur, trembling. "Good boy," he whispered. "Good soldier." That was the last time Wojtek ever saw one of his brothers in arms. On a cold December morning in 1963, Wojtek lay quietly in his pen, breathing slow, deep breaths. The zookeepers found him asleep, curled on his side. He had passed peacefully during the night, a soldier to the end. He was 21 years old. The news spread quickly. In Edinburgh, people wept. Across Britain, newspapers printed obituaries. In Poland, where his story had long been suppressed by Soviet censorship, exiled soldiers shared the news in hushed tones. Wojtek is gone. But gone was not forgotten. The Scots erected a plaque in his honor. Polish communities across Britain collected donations to memorialize him. Veterans wrote his name into their memoirs, ensuring that even as the men of the Polish II Corps faded from memory, the bear who served beside them would live on. He was more than a mascot, more than a curiosity of war. He was proof that kindness, courage, and companionship could exist even in the darkest times. And somewhere, in the memories of the men who once fought with him, the legend of Private Wojtek still marched, not on battlefields, but in the quiet hearts of those who remembered what it meant to fight for something larger than themselves. For a time after his death, Wojtek's story drifted into silence. The world had changed. The war was 2 decades behind, and the men who remembered him were gray-haired now, their medals tucked away in drawers. Poland remained behind the Iron Curtain, cut off from the West, its history rewritten under Soviet eyes. In that rewritten history, there was no place for Wojtek. He had served under the banner of the Polish army in exile, under British command, and so to the communist regime, he symbolized an inconvenient truth, the courage of free Poles who refused to bow to Moscow. And so, for years, the bear who had carried shells through Monte Cassino was forgotten in his own homeland. But legends, like old soldiers, never truly die. In Scotland, children still spoke of him. In Polish clubs across Britain, veterans told his story to their sons and daughters, a bedtime tale about a gentle giant who drank beer, carried ammunition, and saluted officers like a proper soldier. It was only in the 1980s that historians began to uncover the full story again. Old photographs surfaced. Wojtek standing on his hind legs beside laughing soldiers, a bear's paw resting on a man's shoulder. War diaries mentioned him by name. And then came the testimonies. Dozens of surviving veterans recalling the bear who had shared their journey from the sands of Persia to the mountains of Italy. A BBC documentary soon followed, The Bear That Went to War. It aired to millions of viewers, sparking something unexpected, a wave of emotion from both Poles and Scots who realized they shared this strange, beautiful piece of history. Suddenly, Wojtek was everywhere. In Edinburgh, schoolchildren painted murals of him. In Krakow, students whispered about the Polish bear who fooled the Nazis. And in London, the Polish community began to raise funds for a statue, not just for the bear, but for the soldiers he represented. In 2015, more than 70 years after he carried his last shell, bronze met sunlight in Edinburgh's Princes Street Gardens. The statue showed Wojtek standing tall, a shell in his paws beside a Polish soldier. The inscription read, "To commemorate Wojtek, the soldier bear, who served with the Polish army during the Second World War and lived in Scotland after the war." At the unveiling, thousands attended, veterans' families, diplomats, Scots, and Poles alike. Bagpipes played alongside Polish military hymns. Children waved both Scottish and Polish flags. And as the speeches began, one old man in a faded uniform raised his trembling hand in salute. "He was one of us," he said. "He was our brother." Another statue followed in Krakow, Poland. A homecoming, decades late but deeply symbolic. There, Wojtek was finally honored not as a footnote, but as a national hero. Schoolchildren laid flowers at his bronze paws. Teachers told his story in classrooms. And in a country once divided by war and occupation, his memory united people in laughter and pride. Because Wojtek's story was never just about war, it was about humanity. The strange, miraculous way that loyalty and love can bloom even in chaos. He reminded the world that friendship doesn't need words, that courage can come in fur as well as flesh, and that even in history's darkest moments, kindness endures. Today, you can trace his footsteps across continents, from the Iranian desert where he was found, to the mountains of Italy, to the quiet hills of Scotland where he rests in memory. His likeness stands in parks, museums, and war memorials. His name is taught in schools. His story has become part of both Polish and Scottish heritage. And every spring, when poppies bloom at Monte Cassino, a few are always placed beside the monument to the 22nd Transport Company, the company whose emblem was a bear carrying a shell. Private Wojtek, a soldier, a comrade, a legend. He never spoke a word, but his silence told a story louder than any battle cry. A story of courage, loyalty, and love that still moves the world more than 80 years later. And somewhere, in the echoes of old battlefields and the whispers of history, it feels as if he's still there, standing tall, watching over his brothers, waiting for the next command that will never come. Imagine the scene, a crisp spring morning in Edinburgh. The city is waking up, gulls crying over the castle, buses rumbling down Princes Street, and a soft wind moving through the gardens. And there, in the middle of it all, stands a bronze bear, sunlight catching the curve of his back. Children laugh as they climb on the statue, tracing the smooth metal of his paws. Some know his name. Some just call him the Soldier Bear. But for those who do know the story, Standing before that statue feels like standing at a window into history, a reminder that heroism doesn't always wear medals, and that war, for all its cruelty, sometimes forges the most unlikely bonds, because Wojtek wasn't supposed to matter. He was just a cub, bought by soldiers for a few coins in a market. He didn't choose sides, didn't care for flags, didn't understand orders, and yet, when men around him faced fear, hunger, and death, he carried their burdens, literally and metaphorically, with unshakable loyalty. When bullets cracked through the mountains of Monte Cassino, Wojtek did what he always did. He worked, he followed, he trusted. He was a creature of instinct, yet somehow, he became a symbol of something deeply human, resilience. After the war, as the soldiers who loved him grew old, their children asked them about the fighting, the horror, the loss. They didn't always speak of that. They spoke of the bear who shared their cigarettes, the bear who saluted officers, the bear who made them laugh when laughter felt impossible. And maybe that's why Wojtek's story endures, because it's not just about war. It's about the fragile beauty of decency in indecent times. When you stand before his statue today, you'll see the details the sculptor included. The soft lines of his fur, the shell in his arms, the calm determination in his face. There's no aggression, no roar, just quiet strength. A reminder that even in war, gentleness can be its own form of courage. In Poland, veterans who served with him are gone now, but their grandchildren still tell his story. In Scotland, schoolchildren learn about the soldier bear who came from far away and became one of their own. And every few years, someone leaves a bottle of beer beside his monument, a small tribute to an old friend. Somewhere between myth and memory, between the blood-soaked battlefields and the green hills of home, Wojtek's pawprints remain. Not just in earth or stone, but in the way people remember. How they laugh when they picture him wrestling soldiers, how they pause when they hear he carried shells at Monte Cassino. He reminds us that even in the worst of times, something innocent can survive and even thrive when surrounded by love. So, when the sun sets over Edinburgh and the light turns bronze to gold, you can almost imagine him moving again. The soldier bear, still standing watch, a silent guardian of a past that refuses to be forgotten. Because Wojtek didn't just serve in the Polish army. He served humanity, by reminding it what it means to be human. Years passed. The guns fell silent. Europe was a patchwork of ruins and ghosts, and the men who had once marched through smoke and fire now tried to build something that resembled peace. For the Polish soldiers of Anders' army, those who had fought alongside a bear named Wojtek, peace came with a strange emptiness. They had survived the unimaginable, but they had no home to return to. Poland, their homeland, had been liberated by the Soviets, which in reality meant replaced by a new kind of occupation. For many of the men who had fought for freedom, going back meant imprisonment or worse. So they stayed where they were, in Italy, in England, in Scotland, scattered like seeds blown by a war-torn wind, and in Edinburgh. Their comrade lived among them, the one who could not understand politics, could not mourn a lost country, but who felt their grief in the silence of the evenings. Wojtek the bear had gone from the thunder of Monte Cassino to the quiet rhythm of Scottish hills. The Edinburgh Zoo was his final post, and the staff quickly realized that this was no ordinary animal. He would rise when Polish voices called his name. He would stand, salute, and stretch his arms as though expecting a shell to be placed in them once more. Veterans visited often, wearing their old uniforms and medals. They brought chocolate, fruit, cigarettes, and beer, the small comforts of another life. When Wojtek saw them, he would rumble low in his chest, a sound between joy and recognition. The zookeepers said he was happiest on those days. They said he seemed to remember. Sometimes, on summer afternoons, when children pressed their hands to the bars of his enclosure, he would sit upright, grand and still, as though posing for a photograph. One little boy once asked his father why the big bear looked sad. The man only said, "Because he remembers things we can't imagine." That man was right. The veterans never forgot him. In 1947, during a reunion in London, a former Polish sergeant raised his glass and said, We left many brothers behind in the mountains, but only one of them could make us laugh while carrying a shell. The room erupted in laughter and tears. That was the thing about Wojtek. He had seen war, and yet his story brought warmth, not horror. He represented a rare kind of innocence that somehow survived amid destruction. By the 1950s, newspapers around the world began rediscovering the tale of the soldier bear. Journalists printed old photos of him wrestling with soldiers, of him sharing cigarettes, of him saluting officers. People who had never heard of Monte Cassino now learned it through his story. And perhaps that was fitting. Because Wojtek wasn't just part of the war, he was a reminder that humanity could endure within it. As the years wore on, the men who had once fought beside him began to fade away, one by one. But each of them carried the same memory: the warmth of his fur, the sound of his heavy footsteps in the mud, the way he brought laughter into places where death was only a heartbeat away. When Wojtek died in December 1963, the news spread quietly at first. But then letters began arriving at the zoo. From Poland, from Italy, from America. Soldiers wrote that they had cried when they heard. One said, "We have lost our comrade, the last one who never betrayed us." They buried him with honor, not as a mascot, not as an animal, but as a fellow soldier. In the decades that followed, something strange happened. The legend of Wojtek began to grow again. Not through grand monuments or military parades, but through whispers, stories, and art. Writers told his story in books. Painters captured him in murals. Children's books reimagined him as a hero. Historians wrote about his journey from an orphaned cub in Persia to a soldier on the Italian front. In Krakow, veterans raised money to build a statue. In Edinburgh, another followed. At both ceremonies, elderly men in faded uniforms stood at attention, their medals catching the light. When the cloth was pulled away, revealing the bronze figure of the bear carrying a shell, many of them wept. They weren't just remembering him. They were remembering themselves, the young men they had once been, and the war that had taken so much but somehow given them this strange, beautiful companion. The monuments were not just for Wojtek. They were for memory itself. Because Wojtek's story asks something deeper. What does it mean to serve? He didn't fight for a flag. He didn't hate an enemy. He didn't understand the politics that drove nations to war. He served in the simplest, most honest way, by being there, by helping, by giving strength where others had none left. Maybe that's why people still talk about him. In an age of cynicism, he represents something pure. Loyalty without calculation, courage without cruelty. When tourists visit the Edinburgh Zoo today, many still walk to the spot where his enclosure once stood. Some leave small trinkets, a bottle of beer, a toy bear, a poppy. Others just stand there quietly, as if expecting to hear that familiar grunt or see the glint of mischief in his eyes. And in Poland, every year on Soldiers' Day, a small crowd gathers near his statue. Children lay flowers. Old veterans salute. One man, now well into his 90s, once said through tears, "When the world was madness, he was our sanity." The story of Wojtek the Bear reminds us that war is not only about destruction, it is also about endurance, about finding shards of kindness amid the wreckage. It tells us that even the smallest act of goodness, sharing a piece of fruit, a laugh, or a burden, can ripple across time and outlast the roar of cannons. Wojtek lived and died long ago, but his shadow lingers over both Poland and Scotland, a symbol not just of military service, but of the strange, miraculous humanity that can survive even in war. And maybe that's the real lesson his story carries. You don't need to understand the world to make it better. You don't need to speak to be remembered. Sometimes it's enough just to stand beside someone and carry their weight when they can't. Somewhere in a forgotten corner of the zoo, perhaps the earth still remembers the heavy press of his paws. The laughter of soldiers echoes faintly in the wind. The bear who carried shells at Monte Cassino still walks there, in memory. Quiet, loyal, eternal. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the whisper of his name. Wojtek. The soldier who never fired a shot, but won hearts across the world. Years after Wojtek's passing, long after the last veterans of the Polish II Corps had joined him in whatever heaven soldiers earn, his story kept resurfacing, not in history textbooks but in hearts. In Edinburgh, a young zookeeper once found an elderly man standing silently at the spot where Wojtek's pen had been. The man wore a faded uniform and held a cigarette between trembling fingers. He didn't speak for a long time. When the keeper finally asked if he was all right, the old soldier smiled faintly and said, "He used to steal these from me." Then he laid the cigarette on the ground and walked away. That simple gesture, quiet, human, ordinary, said everything about what Wojtek had meant. He wasn't a symbol built by propaganda or polished speeches. He was a comrade, a friend, a reminder that in war's darkest hours, decency could still survive. In the decades that followed, his legend spread beyond Poland and Britain. Documentaries were made. Statues rose in Krakow, London, Duns, and Monte Cassino itself. Artists sculpted him standing tall, a shell in his paws, eyes forward, as if still serving, still ready. Children wrote essays about him. Veterans' families shared stories passed down through generations, of laughter around campfires, of the great brown bear who drank beer and saluted officers, of the soldier who made them believe in goodness again. Even the Polish government, long silent about the soldiers of Anders' army, eventually reclaimed his story with pride. A postage stamp bore his face, not as a cartoon, but as a fellow soldier, the way his comrades remembered him. But perhaps the most touching tribute came not from officials or historians, but from the people who knew him least, the children who read about him in schools. To them, Wojtek wasn't just a war hero. He was proof that courage comes in many forms, that compassion can exist even in chaos, that a bear could be more human than many men who went to war. Some of the veterans' descendants still visit the statues. One Polish woman, whose grandfather had served under Anders, brought her little son to Wojtek's monument in Edinburgh. The boy stared at the bronze bear, holding a shell bigger than his head, and asked, "Mama, was he real?" She smiled, brushing her hand over the engraved name. "Yes," she said softly, "he was real. And he was one of the good ones." The boy looked up at the statue for a long time, then saluted. Maybe that's the only ending this story ever needed. A small boy saluting a bronze bear, bridging the past and the future in one quiet gesture. Because Wojtek's legacy isn't about victory or medals, it's about the moments in between. The laughter that echoed between barracks, the muddy paw prints on soldiers' coats, the way he turned fear into something they could live through. He made war feel survivable. He reminded men who had lost everything that life could still be kind, still be funny, still be good. When the soldiers of Anders' army left for Monte Cassino, they carried heavy packs, rifles, and grief. When they came home, or what was left of home, they carried his memory. And that was lighter, warmer, easier to bear. Today, when the world feels fractured again, his story still matters. It tells us that no matter how brutal life becomes, there is always room for empathy, even from a creature who couldn't speak, who didn't know why men fought, but chose to stand beside them anyway. The world has changed since 1942. Wars have come and gone. Borders have shifted. Nations have risen and fallen. But the story of the bear who served endures, because it speaks to something timeless. The need to believe that loyalty and love can exist, even when everything else burns. If you ever visit Edinburgh or Krakow and stand before Wojtek's statue, you might notice something small. A poppy tucked under his paw, a bottle of beer at his feet, a child's toy resting on the base. People still come to leave their thanks, because some soldiers never really die. They live on, not in glory, but in gratitude, and somewhere, if spirits walk, you might imagine a great brown bear lumbering through the misty Scottish hills, pausing by the breeze that carries faint laughter and the smell of tobacco. He stands, raises his paw in salute, and disappears into history, where he belongs, Wojtek, the soldier bear. the comrade who never forgot. And the world, to its credit, never forgot him either.